Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. It is the 5th of October 2019 and today's topic is Fed repo operations, much ado about nothing. And we have news from last night that the Federal Reserve, which had temporarily opened up the repo window and said that it would end in early October, last night said that it's going to go on through I think November 10th. Now, a lot of people are saying this is now endless QE and that it's never going to end, and this means that financial crisis is imminent. We're also hearing stories saying that the Fed is taking any old collateral for this repo, and it's just like 2008. Plenty of sensationalism going on about what the Fed is doing. What we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at exactly what the Fed is doing. But first, let's get current as to where we are. The Fed announced last night, and it's the New York Fed that conducts these operations, says we will continue to offer daily overnight repos for an aggregate amount of at least $75 billion each through Monday, November 4th, 2019, thus extending this liquidity facility another month. Now, a lot of people think this is outrageous, but let's get into what exactly the Fed is doing. And before we even do what the Fed is doing, I want to give you an analogy to keep in mind as we go through this, to show you why this is not what people are saying it is. I am going to tell you that I don't think that the current system is healthy, just as I don't believe that fractional reserve banking is healthy. But QE is different than QE is different than QE. And certain liquidity events are always different from other liquidity events. A liquidity event in and of itself does not mean a financial crisis. So, for example, in your own life, you may have 20 monster boxes of silver but can't pay your rent. Does that mean you're not bankrupt? No. Doesn't mean you're bankrupt. Doesn't mean you're not bankrupt. It means you can't pay your rent because you don't have the available cash that month. But you can easily pay your rent if you sold off your silver, but you don't want to do that because the price of silver is too low. So it's the tenor of your liquidity or the tenor of your assets. You need to convert the silver into cash so that you can spend it. And I'll give you another example. And then we're going to get into the mechanics of the Fed's repo operation. We're even going to take a look at the Fed's balance sheet and go through the difference between the Fed adding to its balance sheet for the repo operations and the Fed adding to its balance sheet when it does monetization of debt and or bailouts. Now, let's look at another example you could understand. The banking system runs on a fractional reserve system. We know that. We know that the banks not only don't have the requisite amount of cash to give you, or they don't even have on their balance sheets enough to cover deposits because they don't expect people to come in and get their money out. But even more troubling than that is that the amount of actual cash supposedly held in deposits at banks is $13 trillion. According to the FDIC, they're insuring $12.898 trillion. So $13 trillion roughly of, quote, cash is in bank accounts, U.S. bank accounts. Now, how much actual cash is there? Meaning, how much physical dollars, half dollars, quarters, $10 bills, $20 bills, $100 bills are there to cover that $13 trillion? Now, think about it. The cash itself is unbacked, but the deposits, the $13 trillion in deposits, are not even backed by an equivalent amount of cash. There's not even an equivalent amount of cash to pay off those deposits. According to the Federal Reserve, there is $1.7 trillion worth of cash in circulation. Also, to cover $13 trillion worth of deposits. But also consider, the Federal Reserve and others have also estimated that $1.7 trillion in cash, at least half and up to 70% of it is overseas. Now, that makes sense. It's overseas. Why? Well, people who live in countries that don't like their own currency travel abroad to certain countries. Argentina, they'll take dollars. Rich individuals will store dollars in other countries. The dollar is used outside of the United States in cash just as a national currency or an alternative currency. So we've got $13 trillion worth of deposits, and we only have 1.7 trillion in actual cash, and probably less than $1 trillion is in the United States. Okay. Let's take a look at two types of bank issues. Let's say there's a bank under the current fractional reserve system, and that bank messes up, makes a lot of bad loans, and essentially now on its balance sheet, its digital balance sheet, is basically insolvent. They can get a bailout. They can be sent money. So if you go to that bank and try to get cash out, or try to even get digital cash, they won't have it because they're mismanaged. That would be a bailout if that bank had to be liquefied. Not liquefied. Had to have liquidity added to it. They would essentially be saying, under the system that we have, the banking system, you messed up. Fractional reserve or not, you still messed up. You don't have a balance sheet that shows that you can meet your obligations to the depositors. That would be a bailout. But let's say instead a bank is doing everything it should be doing under a fractional reserve system. Putting aside, that's what we have. You may not like that, and we're going to show the analogy when we get over to the Federal Reserve. The bank is perfectly solvent the way they count perfectly solvent. They've made loans, yes, they're on a fractional reserve basis, but they have enough to pay their depositors. But let's say, we'll make it localized in the Federal Reserve Bank area of Boston. There is an issue with payment processors. The chips don't work. There's some issue. It's not some major national, international issue. It doesn't have to be a total disaster. But there is a disaster in that commerce is going to stop in the New England area because the chips don't work, the processors don't work. There's some reason why electronic payments are not working, and they haven't been working for a week, and they probably won't fix the system for 3 weeks. So people run to the bank. They make a run on the bank. Are they running on to get cash? Are they running on the bank because the bank itself is insolvent? No, they're running on the bank because they need cash. The bank could meet their cash payments to the depositors in the amounts that the depositors would normally want. So, for example, if you go to the bank and you normally spend $200 in groceries through your debit card, the bank, if it's solvent, could take the $200 out of your account and not have a problem. But if you went to the bank every week during this crisis, and everybody else did, and tried to get $200, they would not have the cash to give you. Again, that doesn't mean the bank is insolvent under the circumstance. It means they don't have the cash. And they're not expected to have the cash. The way the current system works is people aren't using cash as much. They're using their electronic cash. So what if that bank then needed to get from the Fed more cash, actual physical cash, and it operated exactly the same way it normally operates, except that it has to transfer its digital cash and get physical cash sent in pallets to it. That would just be changing the tenor of the cash on their balance sheet. They're exchanging a digital asset for a physical cash asset. There's nothing wrong with that. That just means that the bank does not have the physical specie in cash, but it doesn't mean that that bank is in trouble. All right. If you can understand that, then you can understand what the Fed is doing. So let's take an example where, and then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the Fed's balance sheet and what the Fed is doing. In a bailout, let's say a bank has toxic loans. They made a lot of stupid bets. They're very greedy, and they stacked up on bad paper. And that paper is no good anymore, and it's threatening their solvency because they're not going to get paid on it. They might get paid 10 cents on the dollar. The Fed comes along and they said, oh, okay, well, that's not good. We can't have that. So why don't we just buy that from you at 100 cents on the dollar, and then you're fine. Well, that's a bailout. That's clearly a bailout. That's probably even under the way that the concept of a central bank runs probably shouldn't be allowed, because it basically rewards the bad bank's behavior for its bad behavior and suffers no consequences whatsoever. It's the idea of socializing losses and privatizing gains. If those bets had turned out, they would have made profit, and they don't turn out, don't worry about it. The Fed takes care of it. So that is a bailout. But that's not what's happening right now. Or at least everything we see, there's nothing to indicate that that's what's happening. The Fed repo operation involves allowing banks, the primary dealers, we covered this a couple of days ago. If you go back and check out the video about repos, how the Federal Reserve works with domestic and foreign banks to conduct monetary policy, these primary banks are allowed to go to the Fed and change the tenor of their assets, meaning their agency debt, their agency-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, and their treasuries, and exchange them in the overnight facility from the Fed for cash. All the Fed is doing is allowing this to take place so that this liquid cash market, because we have a dollar shortage, can operate. It is not a bailout of these banks. They have the assets, presumably, a way the system works and according to what they have on their own bank balance sheets. They just don't have the available cash. So they turn their cash, they turn their treasuries, their agency-backed mortgage securities, and their agency debt into cash at the Federal Reserve. This is no different than a bank getting cash in exchange for its digital cash, getting physical cash. This doesn't mean that it's game over and game changer and Fed repo madness. It means, however, and I mentioned this on the Silver Doctor's interview, the system is clearly screwed up and the system is clearly broken, that it requires these shenanigans. But it doesn't mean recession. It doesn't mean the banks are insolvent. It means the system is broken. It means this is what they have to do because they created a system like this. Same with the banks. They don't have your cash. But because they don't have your cash, the way the system works doesn't mean they're insolvent. It means they don't have your cash, and they cannot have your cash for two reasons. A, they ain't got it because their digital balance sheet is screwed up and they're losing money. Or they don't have it because the system doesn't have cash in it. That's a major flaw. $13 trillion worth of bank deposits and only $1.7 trillion of total cash in the world to cover them. But it's not a problem because of the way the system works. And you could say it is a problem, but that's a different problem. It doesn't mean that the bank, under the current way you look at things, is insolvent. The same here with these banks that are participating in the repo facility. So, as we mentioned, let's take a look at the Fed repo facility. What it allows to do is the primary dealers can bring their eligible collateral to the Fed and get cash. Now, let's take a look at what's happened since they started this. The big now attention is the balance sheet is increasing. It's nuts. It's madness. It's QE. No, hold on. Here's the balance sheet. See, people don't show you the balance sheet. They show you their hyperbole and they get all excited. Don't get excited over here. Forget about it. All right, look. Yeah, the Fed's balance sheet is big. There's no two ways about it. But the bulk of it is securities held outright. As you can see at the top, the U.S. Treasuries, they got 2.1 trillion of those guys. They got notes and bonds, and the 1.9 trillion. They got mortgage-backed securities, 1.4 trillion. Now, they do have this repurchase agreement now is showing up as 171 billion. That's a lot because they only started this a couple of weeks ago. But keep in mind, these are very, very short term, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Let's take a look at this short term. These are not bailout assets. They didn't buy garbage. Like you might see if you look at the, if you were to examine the mortgage-backed securities line item or some of the other line items. Now, this does raise the issue. We don't know anything. I mean, unless you do an audit and look at all of this stuff. But there's stuff in the Fed's balance sheet that you could say that's probably not the highest quality, but most of it is. Most of it is, and again, it's whether you agree that U.S. Treasury securities are high quality. The general consensus in the world's financial system is those are the best things you can have. They're like the gambling in the other rackets in the mafia. Those are the things to have. U.S. Treasury securities. repurchase loans are really very good to have because you have the collateral. I mean, there's not really a problem there. You're getting U.S. Treasuries, you're getting agency debt, and you're getting mortgage-backed securities. But let's take a look now at the maturity of the balance sheet. So the U.S. Treasuries that they hold are really mostly, they're the longer term. They're not holding the paper. And again, that's a liquidity issue. They're holding the bulk of their treasuries, 1 to 5 year treasuries, 5 to 10 years, over 10 year, and then the 30-year treasuries. That's where the most of their $2.1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries are held. Mortgage-backed securities, even more, all longer-term securities that they hold. But look at that repurchase agreement. It's 15 days. Now, those repurchase agreements not only are 15 days, but they have the type of collateral that they would hold on their balance sheet otherwise is the high-quality collateral. But also, what people are missing, I'm going to show you a chart. They've done almost $1 trillion or made available $1 trillion worth of repos. So why is the number only 181 billion? Well, it's the nature of the overnight loan. It gets swapped back out eventually. And they also have reverse repurchase agreements, which exactly people are not talking about. That's 288 billion. That's where they actually sell back the securities that they have into the market. So they do a lot of this with European banks when they do dollar euro swaps. All right, so let's look at the Fed repo, what they've done. And every day they publish this. And you can go online, and I'll leave you the links on the Smaulgld.com. They show you what they've done. Now, is it audited? No. Can you trust it? I don't know. But, I mean, they don't just put out. They could, a lot of people believe that everything, they don't trust anything other than the made-up stories that they hear on alternative media. They figure, well, that's as good as anything else. I'd rather believe what they're telling me than maybe believing what the Federal Reserve puts out there. And I know that sounds blasphemy for people. I was talking to somebody who doesn't really follow this stuff, and they said, well, what you're saying makes sense. Like, no, it only makes sense, and it's only obvious if you haven't already been steeped in the nonsense that you can't trust anything, and that everything is some type of a scam, and it's not. I mean, these are how markets function and how market participants are involved. They're not listening to YouTube and binge watching and hearing about how this is just madness and it's the Fed is running a pawn shop. I mean, if you believe that, then you just want to believe a fantasy. And it makes you feel good if you want to believe that and you want to listen to 10 dozens of channels telling you that's what's going on. It's very hard to prove that that's what's going on. It's a little easier to understand that what's happening is we know there's a dollar shortage. We know there's a liquidity issue. It doesn't mean that the Fed is bailing out banks and taking on all of their toxic collateralized loan obligation and mortgage-backed securities that have gone bad. In fact, we'll see in the chart here what's happened is they'll reject some collateral if they don't like it. But here's a chart that shows how much has been submitted and how much has been accepted. I missed a couple of days. I didn't realize what the Fed does is it only keeps the data on the site for, 20 business days. So I know the first day they took 75 billion. And I know that more than that was submitted. But again, you have to submit the good collateral and the Fed has to either accept it or they can expand it. In case you see it on the third, it was at 80 billion. And we don't know whether when these primary dealers are accessing the facility, whether they actually need it and will put it to use, or they're just trying to get a little advantage of getting the loan at a good rate. But there has been, looks like $1 trillion pretty much submitted and accepted since they started this, and they're going to continue to do this. But that doesn't mean that the balance sheet rises every day by 75 billion, which it would if they were buying $75 billion worth of paper every day to hold on to. Again, this is not the Fed buying or bailing out the the banks of these securities, it's taking them as collateral for the loan of the cash. Now, it wouldn't be the end of the world if the Fed did buy this and essentially transformed and said to, look, you banks, instead of us doing it this way, if you don't have enough cash, well, then you shouldn't hold all these treasuries. You should, these longer term treasuries, swap them out for shorter term paper so you can provide the liquidity instead of relying on us. There's definitely something wrong with the system. I'll grant you that. And because the Fed intervenes and because the Fed is there for them to do this, then the banking system doesn't seize up because the, quote, free market of these primary dealers isn't working. But part of the reason it's not working, it's already been massively interfered with by the Fed. So they assume that all problems will get solved by the Fed. And this is a problem that is, quote, being solved by the Fed. But it does highlight that the system itself is broken. But it doesn't mean within that broken system that the Fed is just bailing out all the banks and picking up their collateral and just increasing their balance sheet because they're mad and they're nuts. And they just, no, this is what they do because of what they've already done. This is a way of changing the tenor of banks' collateral that they have on their balance sheet that presumably shows that they're solvent. Now, we don't know if they are, but presumably they are, and then the Fed will take that collateral, which is presumably good collateral. Again, if you assume that U.S. Treasuries are good collateral and agency mortgage-backed securities are good collateral, well, then all they're doing is swapping that collateral for cash in order to liquefy the markets, meaning add liquidity to those markets. All right, let's see what you guys are saying. But again, keep in mind what we talked about. When you change the tenor of an asset, that's what's happening. It doesn't mean if you don't have enough cash, you're bankrupt. You could go bankrupt, and that's a fact. There are companies that, let's say, for example, a company has a lot of land, but its cash flow is very, very poor and it can't pay its employees and it won't be able to sell the land in time. Well, then there's a problem. It can't go run into the Fed and say, I want you to take all this land and give me a lot of cash for it tomorrow so I can pay my employees. That's the difference. But that's a company that will go bankrupt, will go out of business, but then when it sells its assets, may be able to get back on its feet because it can sell billions of dollars worth of land. So we have to keep in mind the difference between being structurally unable to meet your liabilities, like the banks, meaning they were unable to service a market, they don't have enough cash, and being technically and actually bankrupt. Again, you go back to the example where you got 20 monster boxes of silver, but you can't pay your rent. Now, that highlights that silver's not a good medium of exchange, but the point is you're not technically bankrupt. You're not even poor. I mean, how much is a monster box? What is it? $10,000. So if you've got 10 of those, you got $100,000. You're not out of luck. You just can't pay your $1,000 rent this month or $800 rent this month. So the concept again is there's a difference between a bailout and providing liquidity on good collateral. That's what's happening in the repo market. There's a difference between being out of money and out of cash, which would be the example of your monster box but not being able to pay the rent. There's a difference between a bank not being able to meet depositors' withdrawals because they don't have the balance sheet to meet it digitally or in cash because they've made bad loans, and a difference between whether that bank actually has cash on hand. A bank that doesn't have cash on hand doesn't mean it's a failing bank. That's just the way the banks work today. They don't have enough cash to meet deposits. And again, that means to me the system is broken. But the way they define the system, that doesn't mean it's broken. It just needs cash, and they can send them cash as long as they wire them the equivalent amount of cash. All right, well, if you've enjoyed this, I hope you become a Smaulgld patron. Or let me put up the fundraising. I do appreciate those people who appreciate what I'm talking about, because most of the channels that do really well will tell you the exact opposite of what I told you, and I think what they're telling you isn't correct. They're not going through. They're telling you almost what you want to hear. As a friend of mine told me, people get off on this kind of stuff, hearing how bad everything is and how screwed up everything is, and now they're getting the truth. they're actually getting the truth from these channels, and they're going to learn, and you'll see when it all comes crashing down on your head, and you'll be lucky you binge watched all these pumper videos about, I mean, we hear it all the time. Repo, gold back yuan, China to crush the dollar. It goes on and on. Shemitah, it never ends. No one wants to give you good analysis. They just want to tell you something so they can sell you silver or gold or get more subscriptions or whatever they're up to. All right, let's see what you all are saying in the comments section. I'm going to pull up this fundraiser because that is very important, because I do appreciate all of the Smaulgld patrons and subscribe star members and the mug stackers. A lot of people have been buying Smaulgld mugs. That does help the channel out. So if you like this type of analysis, I do appreciate the support, because you're not going to get this anywhere else. The mainstream media also has an interest in promoting this narrative, game over now and game changer, because a good amount of them are against the president. And they want a recession, and they want bad stuff to happen. So you got the gold pumpers, you got the silver pumpers. They think bad news is good for gold and silver. You got the mainstream media thinking bad news is good. Dollar collapse, Russia to de-dollarize, all that stuff. That's good for them because that hurts Trump, they think. And then, of course, people that are just promoting their own channels and their own newsletters, they can sell a lot of that stuff just by telling you how screwed up everything is. Now, I'm telling you everything is screwed up, but not in the way that they're telling you it's screwed up. All right. Let's see here what we've got in the questions. We've got a good crowd here for a Saturday morning. Remember, tonight is Saturday night silver with Smaulgld. We're going to discuss silver. Phil is here. Phil, I hope you joined here at the beginning and you have a better understanding. I hope everyone does what the Fed is actually doing, or at least actually what they're saying they're doing. Again, I can't vouch for what the Fed is saying they're doing, and I certainly can't vouch for what the other channels are saying that the Fed is doing. What I can do is present actually the circumstance that we find ourselves in and what the Fed is saying it's doing. And silver stock, yes, they can print the money. The one thing is the monetary and fiscal policy must be joined together, says Mario Draghi, because we need to be able to print the money when we need to print the money. And that is a way of adding liquidity. You print the money. Hoarding bank credit and restricting physical cash, that's no recipe for economic stability, says what every man should have. Yeah. Again, the system is screwed up. I mean, that was the title of my Silver Doctors interview. I didn't make that title up, but that's one I don't agree when I get interviewed on other channels, they make up a title, it's hyperbole. But that is, I do agree with the Silver Doctors characterization of my my interview, that the system is screwed up. It is broken. But it doesn't mean, because it's broken, that the Fed's a pawn shop right now. It doesn't mean that that the banks are all in trouble. It means, on its face at least, that banks don't have the proper diversity of assets in order to provide liquidity to the market. So the Fed jumps in and says, we'll provide it, but you got to give us your good collateral. Okay, old pa stink. Yes, banks normally lend to each other in the repo market, but when rates go to 10% between banks and the Fed steps in and says, don't worry about it, we'll lend at 2%, that's a bailout too. Not really. It's a bailout of the market. Think of it in a real free market, which we don't have, old pa stink. Follow this. The banks were willing to lend the cash at 10%. No skin off their nose if they don't lend it. It was going to be a systemic issue, not a bank issue. If you have, okay, I go back to when I was a child. I had a Hot Wheel car. And a friend of mine wanted to buy it. And I said, no. I paid 50 cents for it and 2 box tops. And then he said, I'll give you $1 for it. And I said, no, I want this car. And then he said, well, I'll give you $5 for it. And I said, okay. And I charged him $5. Then I wanted it back. I had to pay him $5. But the point is that no one is bailing out anyone, because if the kid had to take out a loan from his mother to pay $5 for the car from me, that's not a bailout. That's basically, he doesn't have to pay $5 for the car, and I don't have to sell it. The point is that if the Fed is bailing out the market at 2%, the market didn't close down. It did exactly what it did. The bank said, look, we don't have any money to lend at 2%. We don't have to lend the money, but if you want it, how about 10%? Well, that's not good for the system. So it's not a bailout of the banks. It's basically the Fed saying, look, remember, if you go back and listen to the repo thing that I did, it's so incestuous. The Fed actually says, let me see if I can find the language for you. They actually say these primary dealers are required to be primary dealers to work with us to help set monetary policy. And they're supposed to participate in treasury auctions. They're basically supposed to be vassals of the Federal Reserve. So they're not really bailing them out. This is the arrangement that they have. And if the Fed, if the primary dealers have arranged their affairs and they have too much in treasuries and not enough cash, well, why do they have too much in treasuries? Probably because they were required to participate in auctions to add those treasuries to their balance sheet instead of keeping cash so they can lend it in the repo market. So it's not a bailout of them, because it's a bailout if they were buying their bad assets. They're not buying their bad assets. They're allowing them to post as collateral their treasuries that they were forced to buy. So it's not the same as a bailout. I know people want to believe it's a bailout. It's not. A bailout is, I'm not going to even bother looking for that thing. It's only a bailout if they were to buy their bad assets and not have to, it wasn't a loan. This is a loan on their good assets, their U.S. treasuries. I know people don't want to believe that. They want to believe this is all like a bailout and it's QE. It's not. That doesn't mean they won't do QE, but that's not what this is. DB stupid. The banks don't want to do repo on mortgage-backed securities right now. They know what's coming. I will calm down on this topic. Banks are taking back the collateral in a short period. If this is a cash shortage, why is the banking system suddenly short of cash? Well, that's obvious. There is a dollar crisis worldwide where there's so much cash that's required in the system, and the higher the price of the dollar goes, the more the dollar is in to pay back loans, the more dollars are needed. So if you take out a loan, if you're in Turkey and you issue dollar-denominated loans, and the value of the lira goes down 30%, but you got to pay back your dollar, you need 30% more dollars. Look, even in the cash portion of it, DV, the liquidity just for cash is low. We only have 1.7 trillion in circulation, and there's 13 trillion in U.S. deposits, and there's like 45 trillion in euro dollars. I mean, there's such a demand for dollars, and it cannot be met through all the commercial banks. There's only 29 primary dealers. Repo liquidity is not supposed to add on the Fed's balance sheet, which I've been supposed. Well, it isn't. If you go back, Pablo, if you look at the chart I prepared, each time they raise the facility, they would have $1 trillion added already. Remember, it's short term. It comes back. They do reverse repos. So it doesn't keep getting added. They don't keep piling on. It's not like every day. I saw somebody was trying to tell me, well, 75 billion a day, they'll be over $1 trillion in no time, 2 trillion. That's not how it works. It would work that way if they were buying bad collateral. Every day if they said, like some channels are saying, step right up and just unload your garbage on us and we'll buy it from you. Well, then they're stuck with $75 billion a day worth of garbage. That's not what they're doing. They're loaning on 75 billion on 75 billion worth of good collateral. And they're not gonna keep it. Presumably it gets reverse repoed very quickly. So it's not going to, it could grow, but the idea is that even if the Fed got stuck with this, it's not that they're getting stuck with anything. That's bad. All right. Alan 30189, I got here late. Okay, well, you can go back and listen. Ariel Backway, why is the Fed adding to its balance sheet faster than it ever did during QE? Okay, well, I just answered that question. This is hard for people to understand. There's adding to the balance sheet and there's adding to the balance sheet. I think I explained the difference between when you do a bailout. If the Fed goes to Goldman Sachs and says, uh-oh, you're in a lot of trouble, you're going to go out of business, you have $75 billion worth of toxic paper on your balance sheet. And JP Morgan, you have $75 billion worth of toxic stuff on your balance sheet. And all 29 primary dealers got $75 billion worth of toxic assets on their balance sheet. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to print the money, and we're going to give you $75 billion, and you'll give us the garbage, okay? Well, in that case, the balance sheet would be growing, and it would be a disaster because the Fed will be buying trillions of dollars worth of garbage, and the balance sheet would be growing. However, if the balance sheet is growing merely by changing the tenor of the primary dealer's assets, i.e., their mortgage-backed securities and their treasuries, and turning it into cash, that's not the same increase in the balance sheet, dangerous increase in the balance sheet. I didn't say it was business as usual, but what it is merely the Fed acting as a facility to turn good collateral, stuff that actually has in their system, has pure and full 100% value, into a more liquid form. Just like if you couldn't pay your rent, but you had 10 monster boxes of silver, it wouldn't be business as usual. If somehow you had to get a loan on your silver, or if you could get a loan on your silver for 100 cents on the dollar, that would mean nothing is wrong. It would just mean you have a short-term liquidity crisis. You have too much silver, not enough cash. I hope you understand that, because people are just making it in a very, almost a mindless way. The balance sheet is increasing. It's increasing faster than QE, so there must be a problem. Well, there is a problem, but it's a different problem, and it's being solved in a different way. It's not the same type of QE as buying toxic assets and holding them. This is loaning on good assets. There's a huge difference in that. All right. I would have bought 10 more Matchboxes for $5 and sold them to the same more, and then I have 50. Yeah, well, this is third grade. I don't even know if I told the story correctly. This is third grade economics. Actually, the way it turned out was I'm trying to remember if you're interested. The car was a Boss Hoss. And in order to get it, I think you had to send in like Hawaiian Punch certificates or coupons and 50 cents, and which is what I did, and it was awesome. Because normally today, actually, the worst part about this is Matchboxes are cheaper today than they were in 1969. But anyway, I bought the thing. It was a good bargain. I understood its value, and someone else really wanted it, and they want to pay me $1. I was like, it's not worth it. Anyway, I think he paid me $5 for it. But then the worst part is I wanted to buy it back, and he wouldn't sell it back to me. And then finally said, okay, for $5. And I remember I had to sneak out quarters, and I remember separating the silver ones out to buy it. But that's just economics, and has nothing to do with what we're talking about. All right. Dollar shortage I take with a grain of salt. Well, you could take it with a grain of salt, Pablo, but I'd say there's a mug shortage that you better take fully seriously, and I think you need another one. All right, what evidence do we have? Okay, see, Ariel, you're listening to these pumper channels. What evidence is it that the Fed is taking good collateral less than good collateral? Okay, I don't know. Can you prove a negative? Can you prove that JP Morgan is not buying silver? See, this is the type of story that unless you can, it's the old, if you can prove it's not happening, then therefore it is happening. No one can prove it. Now, what you can do is you can go back and you can probably track these. See, the problem with all these banks, not just the Fed, even they do audits of JP Morgan, they do audits of all the primary dealer banks. You can never follow the track. So you're right. But the thing is, what evidence is there of anything? What evidence is there that they're not taking good collateral? What evidence is there that there is a dollar shortage, that there's not a dollar shortage? I mean, all of it could be made up. The point is that people believe what they want to believe. They just want to believe that everything is messed up, so they tune in every night and listen to somebody ranting and raving, and then go on to 20 other channels ranting and raving about everything is messed up, and somehow this is going to make your gold and silver worth more. That's the primary reason people want to believe all this stuff. What evidence is there that the Fed is taking good collateral than less than good collateral? What evidence is that they're not? A YouTube channel saying that they aren't? A YouTube channel ranting and raving and saying that the Fed is just buying garbage, taking on garbage. Well, I'd rather believe them. Okay. Again, believe what you want to believe. Let's see. DB Stupid, look forward to the reverse repo stories. U.S. Treasuries to me are not something I would want to hold, but I'm like 0.1%. I like my gold. Right. That's true, DB Stupid. Again, you and I don't have to think that U.S. Treasuries are good collateral or worth anything, that you're ever going to get paid on a 30-year. Doesn't matter. The world somehow thinks that that's the best asset to have. Yes, Pablo says that he's going to add to his balance sheet one super mug. Yes, you can buy the platinum. Send me the $1 million and I'll send you the platinum fake plated small gold travel mug, and that should cover you. Then all your finances will be fine. So will mine. All right. I think that's it. Yeah, it's very interesting. I was talking to someone before I got it, and they were like, "Okay, so you're not really telling me anything new." And I said, "Yeah, the problem is that most people have been so steeped. It's the same with Fort Knox, the gold at Fort Knox. People want to believe there's no gold at Fort Knox because they've been told there's no gold at Fort Knox. But they also want to believe that the United States is this massive country that goes around, uses its military, and steals gold from other countries and prints up a lot of money. Okay, I won't deny that. So if that's the case, why couldn't the United States have $400 billion worth of gold? I mean, how hard would it be for them to steal a lot of it, print up a lot of money, and buy it? Oh, well, you believe the official numbers. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that gets pumped. And I'm looking at the page views and the views on videos on, well, if silver will be $150. Remember Greatest Wealth Transfer this decade back in 2010. Won't be long before 500 ounces, or probably even less, maybe 200, 300 ounces of silver will buy a single family home. Probably no later than 2015. People have this stuck in their craws, like this is fact. And so they listen to these channels, they believe these channels. JP Morgan's buying Silver Eagles. You can't prove that they're not, so therefore they are. People love to hear it. Oh, yeah? Well, I'd rather believe so-and-so over you because who are you? Well, who is that person? What evidence have they provided that any of this stuff is happening? Well, you can't prove it's not. Okay. So you just make up stuff and then tell people they can't prove it's not. That qualifies as analysis. Errol Blackwood, I think the point is, like you say, nobody knows. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you automatically start binge watching channels that are telling you something that they can't prove. If the collateral is good collateral, then it's huge boost to repo activity, no sweat. But if the collateral is CLO based, we got a big problem. Why would you think it's CLO based unless some YouTube pumper told you it's CLO based? And by the way, there's certain CLOs that are fine. Depends on the rating. You can't believe the rating. See, once you get into starting with a premise that everything is screwed up, then you're just going to say everything is screwed up and we won't know unless we audit everything. We won't know unless we examine every piece of paper. You're never going to get to that. It's okay to speculate, but to present it as fact, I think, is very misleading. Are any banks shorting gold, or are they all scared of the stuff due to the crackdown on the JP Morgan people? Well, Alan, actually, in those cases, it wasn't just JP Morgan. I talked the other night about there was Morgan Stanley, there was Mitsubishi Bank. There's so many of these banks are involved in this trading. And it's not just gold and silver. It's another point I made out. All these banks that are involved in these trading operations, scandalous. They are getting fined all the time. It's not just gold and silver. All the markets have manipulation in them. And by the way, not all the manipulation is short manipulation. Spoofing goes in both directions. They really don't care for the most part. They'll spoof that they're going to buy, and then they don't buy. I got it. I ain't got it. No. Boom. Down goes the price. Up goes the price. So I don't think it's ever going to stop. They just find different ways of spoofing, different ways of manipulating. That's just the state of play, Alan. All right. So go back. I'll try to link to all this stuff on the website. I mean, look, I went on the Fed site. They're publishing numbers. Can I prove them? No. But can the person and the people telling you that they're picking up bad collateral and CLOs and throwing around three-letter acronyms tell you that that's what they're doing? You can believe it if you want, but I don't know why you'd swear by it, insist by it, repeat it, and then go watch 7 other channels that are saying the same thing. They have no evidence of that either. The gold back yuan story, I actually had evidence that it wasn't going to happen. And they were insisting that China announced that they were going to do a gold back yuan. There was no evidence that they ever announced they were going to do a gold back yuan. In fact, they're not allowed to do that. The gold's not allowed to leave China. They were never going to do it. It never made any sense. But every pumper channel, Mike Maloney, calls me out in a comment I left that there's no source for any of this. And he says, source, I'll give you a source. And he cites 3 news stories that have no source that are all citing the same non-source. You got to be a little more... Look, I don't want to go into motivations of people or what they're trying to do, but I think you need to kind of think for yourself and not just take it face value because someone's, quote, on your side. Because they're promoting a narrative you want to hear that you got to believe it. It's the same thing that happens in mainstream media. If you want to believe the worst about Trump, tune into MSNBC. You don't care what they say as long as they tell you Trump's going down. You want to hear that Trump is the greatest president of all time, tune into Fox. You don't need to verify any of it. Fox is telling you. They're on your side. They wouldn't lie to you. You want to hear silver's going to the moon? Tune into a silver pumper channel. Tell you that this month is going to be the biggest month ever in silver. Of course you want to believe. If anyone wants to disbelieve it, they must be a shill or working for the banking system or some other nonsense. I don't know. That's where I think this channel adds value. I'm not out to get silver or to get gold or to get anyone, but I'm out to point out that you have to think through this stuff a lot more deeply than most people do. And most people could care less. They're satisfied with thinking that they're thinking deeply about it because they're listening to things and they're hearing a lot. They think that's doing research, binge watching YouTube channels, telling you the same false information or unverified information, not necessarily false. All right, let's have a good night. Hasta luego, mugs to the moon. Okay.